It's a delight to see so many of you joining us today. Thank you so much for coming out for the panel from different parts of the world, from Sri Lanka, from Kenya, from California, and of course, from Toronto, Canada. My name is Shubhra Gururani. I'm the director of York Center for Asian Research, YCAR. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology. I'm really pleased to host our second event in the series Demos, Democratization and Democracy in South Asia, which we launched recently in October 2022 and held our first event on media and democracy in India. Today's event is a second in the series, and we are co-organizing, which we're co-organizing with Jamhoor. I will talk briefly about it. And the third one will be held in fall 2023 with a focus on Pakistan. So please stay tuned for that to come forward. Today's panel, almost to the date, as you'll recall, around March 30th, 31st, early April, the headlines of all national dailies around the world were filled with images of protesters staging mass peaceful protests in front of the presidential house in Sri Lanka, and eventually moving into the president's palace. These protests came as a surprise to those of us who were watching them from a distance. The world had not seen anything like this, and the headlines cried that Sri Lanka's old political order has collapsed, to the country in peril, and so on. And as one observer noted, amid unprecedented inflation, lengthy blackouts, acute food and fuel shortages, the crisis was simmering for a while, and they just reached a boiling point and sparked a months-long wave of peaceful protests, public protests across the nation. The cabinet capitulated quickly, resigning en masse on April 3rd, 2022, and the continuous anti-government street protests, despite enforced curfews, compelled the president to flee the country on July 13, 2022. The people's peacefully expressed frustration, desperation, and anger clearly had an impact. Since then, things seem to have improved, so-called, but the situation on the ground is far from normal. Today, in order to understand how the crisis emerged, what is the context, how did it happen, what have been the fallout of these ongoing crises for different groups, social groups, and in different fronts, and importantly, what comes next, and what, as scholars and students of South Asia, of political and economic contentions and turmoil, can learn from what is going on in Sri Lanka today. It is my real pleasure to introduce a distinguished panel of experts who are joining us from different parts of the world. And I'm honored and grateful for them to coming out at early morning and late at night and share their reflections with us today. I will introduce each one of them shortly before they present, but I would like to also quickly take this opportunity to thank many of those who have made this event possible. Faculties of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Arts and Media Performance and Design, and Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, Departments of Anthropology, Politics, Social Science, Sociology, and most importantly, the Office of the Vice President's Research and Innovation. It is also my pleasure to thank the hard work of coordinating and promoting the event and working with Jamhoor. I would like to thank Alicia Filipovich, our center coordinator, Alex Felipe, our media coordinator, and members of Jamhoor, Hadia Akhtar, and Arsalan Samdani. I also would like to acknowledge the land in which we, the host, York University and YCAR, are located. So let me just read out the land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The treaty is subject of the dish with one spoon, one pan belt covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes regions. Moving forward, I would now like to welcome Professor Jennifer Heinemann, the Associate Vice President Research, to say a few words about York and YCAR. Professor Heinemann is a political geographer who previously served as a director for the Center for Refugee Studies. Her extensive research and writings focus on conflict zones and traces how the dynamics of conflict and disaster, which she calls the dual disasters, create refugee migrants as well as responses to these crises in thinking about international humanitarian responses. She has conducted research in Sri Lanka, Horn of Africa, and Canada. So, welcome to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Shubhra. Welcome to everyone on this call, and especially a warm welcome to our speakers today. I'm honored to be here and to welcome you to York, remotely, as it were. And I am just delighted that that YCAR has been able to convene this event. It's so timely. It is so important. I've been a member of YCAR for many years now, and I especially appreciate the breadth of research that can be done. Asian studies is, or at least Asian research, is both the diaspora and regional geographies, but basically the politics and geopolitics that create economic disaster, as much as other kinds of humanitarian disasters, as Shubhra mentioned. It is a personal topic for me, since I have worked in Sri Lanka for a couple of decades with collaborators. This was a picture actually from Save the Children tsunami response way back after the tsunami. But to Shubhra's point, the politics of peace and the politics of disaster have overlapped for a very long time in Sri Lanka. And so it's a topic very personal and close to my own research interests and my own politics, I would say. But let me welcome you to York on behalf of the Vice President Research, Amr Asif, who is not able to be here today. As Associate VP for Research, I have the privilege of welcoming you in a kind of formal way. But I would like to say that York, in many ways, represents Sri Lanka well. It is the world in a university, in one sense, of all the universities I've had the privilege of visiting in my life. It represents more diasporas from more war zones, and of course Sri Lanka is one of those, than any other place I've been. It's a real privilege to teach and do research here. I did have the privilege also of being invited to a Center for Poverty Analysis meeting in 2014, some time ago now. And I was asked to speak on some of the kind of political economy aspects, the concerns that were rising then around fear of overload of debt. The IMF was saying it's okay to borrow more money. And being in this context where securitization and where, a very strong presence by the government of the day in these spaces of scholarly and critical discussion were present. I remember meeting people at that very meeting who couldn't really explain to me why they were there. So all to say, things have blown up in ways, and not blown up, but all of you will speak to the situation in Sri Lanka, which I'm very much looking forward to. I am, of course, outraged and feel a great amount of despair at what has happened. So I want to say, as my last point here, simply, I know a vote of thanks always comes at the end of a presentation such as those we will hear today, but I would like to make a preemptive vote of thanks on behalf of our office and our university for you being here. I so appreciate it, and I very much look forward to the talks. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your continued support. YCAR really appreciates it. I would now, as I mentioned, that this event, our second event, is co-organized with Jamhoor, and I would like to invite Devyani to say a few words about Jamhoor and the work they're doing. Devyani?
Hello, everyone. I'm Devyani. I'm a PhD candidate with the Department of History at U of T, and a lead editor with the Jamhoor Collective. So just to quickly tell you a little bit about our organization, launched in 2018, Jamhoor is a critical left media organization that amplifies marginalized and progressive voices from South Asia through contributions from students, academics, activists, and organizers. We promote insights that situate the region and its diasporas within capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, casteism, racism, and other structures of power. Shaped largely by the corporate media, public discourse continues to sketch South Asia and South Asians in monochrome. This services everything from imperialist adventures by the US, white supremacist mobilizations across Europe and North America, and anti-minority pogroms in the subcontinent. With the global ascendance of neo-fascist regimes, the discursive material targeting of South Asians has assumed an acute pitch. We want to contest and reverse these representations by generating a dynamic portrait of South Asia, one that is colored by the issues that are most pressing to its Jamhoor, an Urdu word for the people. Most recently, this was demonstrated in our issue on imperialism in South Asia. So do feel free to check that out. We're also a member of the Progressive International, and Jamhoor is very happy to be collaborating with Vaikar for this great panel discussion. And we hope to continue such collaborations in the future concerning South Asia and its populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Devyani. Likewise, we are very happy to be collaborating with you and look forward to future collaborations and organizing events going forward. So off to our panel. The order of presentation is we're going to start with Professor Jayadeva Uyangoda. Those of you who work in Sri Lanka and South Asia, Professor Uyangoda does not need any introduction. He's a professor emeritus in political science and public policy in the University of Colombo. And in August 2016 and until 2017, he held the prestigious Rajni Kothari Chair of Democracy at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, India. Professor Uyangoda has published extensively on Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict, minority rights, conflict and peace processes, democratization, and state reform in Sri Lanka. He has a long list of publications, which I cannot go over right now, but one of his recent publications called Political Science, A Contemporary Introduction, Political Parties in Sri Lanka, Change and Continuity, which he co-edited in 2017, and another one called Local Government and Local Democracy in Sri Lanka, Institutional and Social Dimensions, also co-edited into 2015. He has been a member of Council of Management of Social Scientists Association, a leading non-state academic institution in Sri Lanka, engaged in research, knowledge production, and publishing in the social sciences. He is currently editing a book entitled Democracy and Democratization in Sri Lanka, Paths, Strength, and Imaginations. Thank you so much, Professor Uyangoda, for coming out for our panel today. Really appreciate it and grateful for your input and insights. We have just to get you started, we have a few questions for you, and I'll put them in front of you right now, and you can take them the way you would like to answer them. So we'll appreciate if you could please give us an overview of the political and economic crisis that led to the protests last year. And if you could also highlight some of the shifts in economic and political arrangements that have happened since then. So thank you, and over to you, Professor Uyangoda.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I also want to begin by thanking Shubha Gurwani and her colleagues for inviting me and also for organizing this event. So I'll try to be as brief and as simple possible because I have only 10 minutes to respond to a question that requires a longer discussion. Sri Lanka's economy has been, for several years like a volcano waiting to erupt. So what happened in the 2022 is a kind of a eruption that a lot of people probably knew that it was going to erupt, but not in 2022 in that particular manner. But I think the COVID pandemic and the pandemic-induced economic and social crisis, and also the political crisis that was generated by the combined impact of the economic and social crisis, underline the economic crisis. Now, in Sri Lanka, people don't talk about the social crisis and political crisis. They are mostly forgotten. But last year, in 2022, during the citizens' uprising, all these three were highlighted. There's a deep-seated economic crisis that has structural as well as, short-term roots and causes. I think the long-term structural dimension of Sri Lanka's economic crisis is linked to the nature of the Sri Lankan economy. Actually, for the past 45 years, Sri Lanka has gone through a very protracted process of economic liberalization, starting with in 1978, economic liberalization, then structural adjustment programs in the 1980s, followed by globalization, and finally neoliberal reforms. So that in a way created a certain fundamental structural distortions to Sri Lankan economy. Sri Lankan economy became very much a part of the global economy, very closely linked to the world market, and also the nature of the economy has been such that it became a totally import dependent, manufacture-based economy, and with a kind of a capitalist class that is not very interested in long-term, development in terms of capitalist development or industrial development. And also we also had the Sri Lanka capitalist class that is very much regime dependent. So that's why a lot of people make the argument that, this political corruption and this nexus between the political class and the business class has been one of the fundamental structural reasons for the economic crisis. But there was also, the war, the 25 years of protracted civil war has also been one factor that has contributed to the kind of the stagnation of the economy. The Sri Lankan economy, a lot of people expected after 2009, when the war came to an end, would enter into a new process of at least takeoff, but it didn't happen. What happened in another phase of distorted economic development with close economic links with China, and also with continually dependent on what we call the private credit from the private sources and banks and individuals as well to address the challenge of balance of payment crisis, as well as the dollar crisis, foreign exchange crisis. So what happened in 2020, 2021 are quite interesting economically and politically. There was a regime change in 2019 with a new president being elected who promised to make Sri Lanka a developmental state in the model of combination of China, Singapore, and Malaysia. So then, the whole, it was a kind of a culmination of a long process of democratization in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka politically, the political structure is constitutionally kind of a, very highly executive presidential centric authoritarianism in which parliamentary democracy is subservient to the all-powerful executive branch of the state. But we have a nominal parliamentary process, democracy. But what is extremely interesting is that when the COVID crisis set in, and it created unprecedented social crisis, because in 2020, even the first phase of the Sri Lankan COVID crisis resulted in rapid loss of employment and loss of businesses, and the decline of tourist income, and also this whole erosion of Sri Lanka's base, the foundations of foreign reserves. So as a result, there was a massive, unprecedented foreign exchange crisis, and that's also the foreign exchange crisis is linked to the structural nature of the Sri Lankan economy that I mentioned earlier. So then, there were kind of two waves of, what I call pauperization in Sri Lanka after 2020 amidst the economic crisis induced by the COVID pandemic. Initially, a lot of people, working people, particularly the working class and small businesses lost their, sources of income. That was a rapid spread of poverty among the poor. So the poor people became poorer in that period. And the second phase of the crisis, was the middle class people becoming poorer. So then we have two middle class becoming poor. So there were two waves of, successive waves of, spreading poverty and, pauperization in this country. So then the political crisis was in a way the crisis of the executive presidential system in Sri Lanka. So you can, interpret the economic crisis as also a crisis of the neoliberal economic development model, as the political crisis as the crisis of this executive authoritarian, presidential authoritarian political model of Sri Lanka. So what is unique in what happened in 2022 in the form of citizen protests is that for the first time in the Sri Lankan history, citizens, began to demand, fundamental reforms in the political order. Because there have been a series of protests in Sri Lanka in 1920, 21, and 22 was the culmination of those protests, but no one could have predicted that such a mass, action by the people without prior, mobilization by a political party or any civil society organization. It's almost spontaneous. So that is what was unique in that. So the political crisis at the moment, it has been under some control in the sense that the citizens' movement is no longer active in the sense it was in the 2022. But the new, there's a successor president in July who was appointed by Parliament in Sri Lanka. He managed to put together what I call a tripartite coalition in order to, restore restore the what you call political order. So these three groups, three parties of this new ruling coalition are the United National Party and Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. Podujana Peramuna is the Rajapaksa dominated party, and the United National Party is the political party of the former opposition party, but it's now part of the ruling party. But more importantly, other than these two civilian political parties, there is a military police establishment as one of the most active component of this new ruling coalition. That indicates where Sri Lankan, politics is moving into the kind of direction. The latest development is that the government has gazetted a new legislation to replace Prevention of Terrorism Act. It's called anti-terrorism law, which makes even street protests not only just a crime but also act of terrorism. So there's the way the new ruling coalition is responding to the citizens uprising last year is to bring in new legislation that criminalizes and also makes a terrorist crime even the protests against the government. So we are, in a way, Sri Lanka is moving into a new phase of what I call de-democratization. That is a heightened process of de-democratization that is unfortunately a kind of a response that the ruling party, or rather ruling political class thinks is the most important response that they can find. So Sri Lanka's democracy is once again in crisis. Last year there was a kind of unprecedented and unique political awakening of the citizens, demanding a direct role in the political process. Demanding what they call the system change, demanding an entirely new political culture, demanding that political class to, leave power, right? And leave, the kind of a new generation of, political, political class to, emerge, but it doesn't seem to be emerging. So what we find in Sri Lanka at the moment, the old order is consolidating itself using all the resources of the state and also the IMF support. Right, the IMF has been imposing a kind of, or rather, that we all know the IMF prescriptions for the economic recovery in a crisis like we have in Sri Lanka. So the new policy prescription is to, place the entire burden of economic recovery victims of the economic crisis. That is the poor, the working people, and the middle classes. That's what we have in Sri Lanka at the moment. So maybe I will stop there because I have now exceeded my 10 minutes. So I'll be very happy to respond to any of the questions that you will have during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Professor Uyangoda. Yes, absolutely. This is the politics of de-democratization, which you are talking about, is unfortunately not limited to Sri Lanka, but seems to be, unfortunately, a trend in the subcontinent. So I think there's much to be thinking about on that note. And also, hopefully we'll have some time, but I would like to now invite Professor Thiruni Kelegama. Professor Kelegama is a lecturer in modern South Asian studies at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and a junior research fellow at Wolfson College, University of Oxford. Her work lies at the intersection of political geography and development studies, and her research looks at the political and infrastructural transformations triggered by development in Sri Lanka and the Global South more broadly. For Thiruni, we have a question which kind of emanate from Professor Uyangoda's presentation and something which you yourself have been working on. So could you please say a few words about how the role of, how the legacy of the Civil War has played a crucial role in shaping the economic and political crisis we saw emerge and erupt last year. So over to you, Thirunu, and thanks once again.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Shubhra, and to be part of the roundtable, and especially for giving me a chance to talk with such a distinguished panel of speakers. Before I start, I will add, in case I get kicked out of the Zoom because of my very bad internet, because I'm currently in Kenya, I was at a workshop, I apologize, and hopefully it won't be a problem. The question that you ask is very pertinent and hugely important. I mean, Professor Uyangoda has more or less set the stage up perfectly to start off with, I think, because right now we are almost 1 year into the economic and political crisis. We all watched unfold last year that Sri Lanka is still living through. But it is also 75 years since Sri Lanka got independence from the British. So last but not least, come June, it will also be 1 year since Sri Lanka filed for bankruptcy. So you asked me then what role the legacy of the Civil War played in shaping the crisis of last year, and a crisis that is still ongoing, really. To answer this again, as Professor Uyangoda said, this is more or less worthy of a book, but in mere 10 minutes, I will like to kind of touch on one very important factor that I think that really needs to be highlighted when you talk about the Civil War, the legacy of the Civil War, and what is going on in Sri Lanka right now, and that is the role of development. So addressing the country on February 4th at the Independence Day celebrations in Colombo, President Ranil Wickremesinghe asked, and I quote, "Today we are facing an unprecedented economic crisis hitherto never experienced. Why have we to face such a situation? Who is responsible for such?" So now, unquote. Now, this speech was given at an extravagant celebration, which really exacerbated the rising anger of millions undergoing harsh austerity measures. And Wickremesinghe, whose 7-month tenure as an unelected and unpopular president has been marked by state violence and repression, and he answered his own question. He somewhat acknowledged that this crisis was the result of government policies over several decades. And what he said was, again, let me quote, "All of us are more or less responsible for this situation. We made mistakes from the beginning." He finished this speech then with a questionable, and I would like to say a farcical maybe promise, by claiming we can become a developed country by 2048. So let me then say, why development then? So development is an important, highly contentious word in the history of post-colonial Sri Lanka. Usually this word is taken to refer to economic progress and transformation as we generally understand. But in Sri Lanka, development is and has always been an inherently political project that is synonymous, or one that is synonymous or a conduit for Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. So my question then, maybe, which is also rather an answer to your question, is how do we understand this political project? A project that was and has always been a vehicle for nationalism, a project that was one of the biggest causes for the Civil War and one of the most important, and maybe you can also say one of the oldest reasons for this ongoing crisis. So going back a little, post-colonial Sri Lanka's biggest tryst with development was the Mahaweli Development Program, which was the largest engineering project implemented in the country. So this ambitious project is a large-scale irrigation project that diverted water from the Mahaweli Ganga to the northern dry zone of the country to provide water for paddy cultivation for settlers who are largely brought in from other areas of the country. So this project covered almost 40% of the country and was planned over 30 years, and it was presented as something that would be the driving force behind the island's economy. More importantly than this high modernist project was the first and also the most sustained effort at development to be infused with a deep Sinhala Buddhist nationalist significance. So one hand, what you have is the project which facilitated the mobilizing of this glorious Sinhala nation, returning to its glorious past, which was capturing the territory of the Sinhalese civilization to then create what was seen as the more developed future. So, but at the same time, and this is what is most important, is that it was used as an instrument to displace, exclude, and attack ethnic and religious minorities. But these grand promises of this project were controversial, and it was also the subject of much scrutiny. And it was very quickly noted that these plans were dangerous to the Tamils as early as 1949. But obviously this criticism was overlooked. And instead, this massive development project became the main achievement of J.R. Jayawardena's United National Party when it came to power in 1977. So what that happened then was it was renamed the Accelerated Mahaweli Development Program, and the project was fast-tracked and due for completion in 6 years, with Jayawardena claiming that this project would, and I quote, what he said was, it was the biggest development project in Asia. So despite these grand proclamations and these grand promises of development, what really happened in reality was that the World Bank, which had funded this Mahaweli project with 6 loans, revealed that the project had more or less failed to deliver on the creation of an egalitarian society of smallholder rice farmers. It had only exacerbated existing poverty conditions, with the income of resettled farmers falling well below the poverty level. And eventually this project was declared a failure. But for the Sinhala Buddhist nation, the Mahaweli project was actually a success. And the reason is, while that it brought no development as planned, it had successfully managed to dramatically reconfigure the ethnic ratio of the northern and eastern districts. So through the Mahaweli Authority, thousands of Sinhalese settlers were moved to loosely populated areas in the northern and eastern dry zone to expand the settlement frontier to become farmers. And in the last of the schemes established under the project in Manalaru, or Valioya, as it was renamed in Sinhalese in 1988, Sinhalese farmers were clandestinely resettled with the help of the military. So most of these schemes then of the Mahaweli project were established deep in the hinterland of the provinces, which were inhabited by Tamils and Muslims. And what happened was it made them minorities in their own territories. So it has been largely documented by a large number of scholars and activists and a lot of academia that these development projects and the settlement schemes only contributed to the ethnic segmentation of districts and divisions. So as a result, what happened was the ethnic composition of the North and the East dramatically changed in the ethnic ratios. And these resettled farmers became the frontiersmen of the Northern and Eastern dry zone, and also this ensured that the Sinhalese population and established Sinhala Buddhist hegemony in the dry zone. So what happened when the war finished? So with the end of the Civil War in May 2009, this temporarily halted development project, which was halted because of the Civil War, was restarted. And this happened with the Mahavali Authority and the military. They started to work together and bring in new waves of Sinhalese from the south of the country, mainly Hambantota, which is the home of the Rajapaksas, and neighboring districts. And what happened was people were given land to settle in and around Valliere. Many of these settlers were more or less lured with the promise of paddy land, which never materialized on arrival. And instead, they were given a plot of land to build a house and placed immediately on the electoral register. The military made sure that they do not leave, and any absence of more than 5 days had to be accounted for. And in 2010, the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka also further strengthened the existing extensive and unaccounted power of the Mahavali Authority in the case Environmental Foundation versus Mahavali Authority of Sri Lanka and others by not stopping or reversing the project. So to date, nothing has changed. The Mahavali Authority, under successive governments since the end of the Civil War, continues to issue land to Sinhalese to resettle as farmers in the very areas thousands of Tamils remain displaced from their lands and homes. So this obsession then, if you call it with development, grew. It was a post-colonial project. It grew after the end of the war. And this was basically what the defining thing of the post-war period. So until Sri Lanka defaulted on its loans and declared bankruptcy, it was in the middle of a massive infrastructure boom with new investment directed into development projects such as roads, ports, and airports in its fast-tracked attempt to more or less become a regional and maritime hub. What development was used, and this whole project of development, it was used to nurture political violence instead of countering it. So in 2009, when Mahinda Rajapaksa and his government, what they did was they promised to bring peace and stability through development and reconstruction and prioritized security and economic growth over ethnic reconciliation. When Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected in 2019, and this was through a platform of technocratic governance, security, and discipline, he further ignored the country's religious and ethnic minorities. So his election manifesto, Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, guaranteed the acceleration of economic development. So determined then to make this reality, economic development, a reality at the expense of any other ethnic or political consideration, what the Rajapaksas did was they turned to China as a significant source of investment potential. So since 2000, successive governments have built a large series of development projects constructed with international financing, such as the Lotus Tower in Colombo, the Hambantota Mahinda Rajapaksa Harbour, the airport, the Mattala International Airport, and the Port City project in Colombo. So the goal, again, as I mentioned before, was to become a regional trading hub in the Indian Ocean. So this long-standing manic prioritizing of development, which started then with the Mahavali Development Program, as I spoke about, alongside expanding securitization, increasing authoritarianism, and abuse of emergency regulations at the expense of all other ethnic and political considerations, has multiple consequences. And the Civil War is one. The end of the Civil War only ensured that development was used to assert power and consolidate a triumphalist Sinhala nationalist project. And one of them, the biggest repercussions, is this crisis that we are in today. So today, and I probably do not need to say this, today millions of Sri Lankans are suffering. Poverty rates have increased to almost 26%. 3 in 10 households are food insecure. And what we saw, the protests of last year, which saw the storming of the presidential secretariat and the residencies, official residencies, and finally forced the Rajapaksas out of power, have really amounted to no meaningful reform. And Wickremesinghe's very unpopular appointment in the midst of these protests as president, after a 46-year political career, has only caused more anger. And his decision to postpone the local government elections, which were held in March, resulted in a new wave of protests, which was immediately met with more violence, with more than 24 injured and hospitalized. So then what next? So as I think I've taken up more or less my time, I'd like to end by saying that the one urgent way then to overcome this crisis that we are presently in, as well as the democratic backsliding and the ongoing descent into fascism, is for then this Sri Lankan state to move away from the use of development as a political project. And how do we do that? That is to fundamentally and radically rethink and work towards a new inclusive development model. And this is a model that needs to be centered on growth, that is not centered on growth, but more or less centered on equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thiruni, for those excellent remarks. You've covered a lot, and I realize the time we've given you is certainly not enough. So on that note, you've already begun talking about something which we have. We're hoping for Professor Mythri Jegathesan to elaborate, but let me introduce Professor Jegathesan first. Professor Jegathesan is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Santa Clara University. Her research focuses on the plantation sector and tea industry and has been working there since 2008. Her award-winning book, Tea and Solidarity, Tamil Women and Work in Post-War Sri Lanka, was published from University of Washington Press in 2019, and it details the tea plantation, gender and work relation in the context of ethno-nationalist violence and civil war in Sri Lanka. Professor Jegathesan serves on the executive committee of the American Institute of Sri Lankan Studies and is working on an NSF project on caste, land, and livelihood relations in Sri Lanka's northern province right now. So, Professor Jegathesan, if you could respond to, I think some of the questions have already been touched on about the kind of ways in which the ethno-nationalist politics is being recalibrated in this current moment. So could you please speak to the question, how has the crisis revealed and exacerbated the ruling elite's project of ethno-nationalism? So,
thank you so much to Waikar and also to Jamhoor for bringing us together. It's an honor to actually be with those in the panel. It's to think with this. So I want to kind of approach the question based on my research experience in the plantation sector, and specifically with Malayaha Tamil plantation residents who work on and off of the regional plantation-owned, plantation company-owned estates, but also based on recent conversations with northern Malayaha Tamils who are living and working in northern province and who migrated from the plantation areas between 1958 and 1986 in search of land and livelihood before and during the war. So to answer this question, I want to start with a news item, which I've discussed in many panels before, but I think it's really important to think about, and it really brings together what Professor Uyangoda spoke of and also the details of thinking of Thiruni's comments as well. And it speaks to this core of question about ethno-nationalism. On December 22nd, 2021, the Ministry of Plantation Industries announced it had signed an MOU with the Ministry of Industries, Mine and Trade of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the MOU settled a $251 million outstanding debt of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation with the National Iranian Oil Company. And it outlined that Sri Lanka would send Iran $5 million worth of tea each month to repay the country for oil purchases pending from 4 years prior. So the MOU would stand to be, as Professor Uyangoda described, one of the many kind of last efforts of the now former Rajapaksa regime to alleviate the government's insurmountable foreign debt, to conserve the last of the foreign reserves, dollars, and prevent what would soon become this very severe economic crisis. And it would be the first time in Sri Lanka's post-independence history where tea, a foodstuff item, an agricultural export and commodity, was used to pay back the country's foreign debts. And the government defended the agreement in the press, had to do so internationally as well. But the Planters Association of Ceylon, which represents the interests of the 24 regional plantation companies that are currently operating in the country, expressed their disapproval of the agreement. And I think it's important to pause on their statement. They said, quote, "It doesn't necessarily benefit exporters as we will be paid in rupees, circumventing the free market, and it provides no real value to us." And I think this really speaks to what Professor Uyangoda was describing in terms of, how the capitalist classes are using and, relying on the most marginalized communities, working classes, to pay back these debts. And to also think about the kind of way in which this happened. So I want to use the remaining time just to give a little bit of on the ground kind of descriptions of, what that working class is experiencing based on a recent visit of mine. And just to kind of put in context, in those 4 months as the mass protests began, due to these nationwide shortages of electricity, fuel, food, medicines, and supplies, in Hatton Town, where I worked, and which is kind of in this kind of central hub of the plantation areas, a healthy Malayaha Tamil father of 3 died from dehydration and exhaustion after waiting in line for simply cooking fuel. In August 2022, 3 Tamil Iti estate residents were swept away by floods and died on Kattabula estate outside of the hill station town of Navalapitiya. And they were crossing a river to travel to the fields on which they had to work. Now, just for context, Kattabula estate is located in Kotmala district. And this is something that Thiruni referred to at the Mavali development program, which Kotmala Dam had largely displaced about 11,000 families that were Malayaha Tamil to build that dam and to provide electricity and also water to other areas, not the people who were living there. Kavata Plantations dominates the current price rankings of tea in the district. It won a gold award for specialty tea in China and holds a number of sustainability certifications. And yet when these 3 estate workers died, it was mutual fund organizers from the community who were forced to come together to organize financial support for their families. And while ministers came to visit quite ceremoniously to the estates, all they offered really were these kind of thoughts and prayers, kind of very public gestures, but it still remains that it was community support that had to support these families. Malayaha Tamil, just to context, right? Malayaha Tamil plantation workers comprise one of the most socioeconomically marginalized communities in the country with respect to health indicators, educational outcomes, and income generation. Upon independence, they were disenfranchised and made stateless, and their full citizenship was not reinstated by the government until 2003, well into the Civil War. Up until 2018, the Pradesha Sabha Act did not allow the use of local resources and funds to be used on private estates for simple infrastructural repairs, such as potholes or fixing of water resource management, without the approval of the estate superintendent. So today, a majority of the community in both the plantation areas and also those who migrated and resettled and were then displaced in Northern Province do not have land deeds or property rights, and yet they were situated somehow in a legal contract and moral obligation under the government to produce an agricultural commodity to repay the nation's foreign debt of $251 million US. So I think for us to kind of ask who was at the decision-making table to determine the value of the tea they produced and the $5 million monthly tea value, especially when they who pluck the tea and produce the tea earn incomes that are determined by a collective wage agreement contract between select trade unions and companies to receive a mere 1,000 rupee daily wage. And it should I don't have time to go into the kind of agreements on which the minimum wage board was brought in by the Rajapaksa government, the fact that this is not a living wage and it's still inadequate. And also to note that in the months ahead of the MOU, the companies filed a writ petition in the Court of Appeals against and kind of saying they cannot pay this wage. And while that was dismissed in August of last year, I think it really speaks to what Professor Uyangoda was speaking about with the introduction of new legislation, these kind of repetitions or new forms, legal ways of repressing the most marginalized communities. And I think it speaks to the thinking about how ethno-nationalist agendas, namely ones that exclude minorities based on class, caste, location, and labor heritage, operate within this free market regime to challenge what could be distributive or more restorative forms of economic justice for Malayaha Tamils. As Ahil and Kelegama and recently in an article, Devaka Gunawardena and Sindhuja Sridharan recently evidenced, and as the panelists before me have said, the IMF recommendations which adhere to the free market really, they are these austerity measures that are introducing wage repression and also these plans to privatize state assets. And they have in fact widened the gap between Sri Lanka's elite and most wealthy and the most marginalized. For Malayaha Tamils working in the plantation sector, and also to note that many do not work in the plantation sector. They work in informal and unorganized sectors in Northern Province, in Colombo and other hill station towns, and off of the plantation for smallholders, for largely unregulated, what is known as kaikasu or daily wage without EPF, ETF benefits. So for instance, those who are domestic workers, migrant workers in the Middle East, shop and office workers, construction workers, issues of gender, caste, class, and ethnic discrimination have long been overlooked by the majoritarian government's response to the crisis. And it's really up to trade unions that are not politically aligned or kind of responding to what's been, this politics of patronage to the government to really advocate for their rights. Just to provide some ground, evidence of this, in a recent visit to the States in Central Province just this last month, workers shared with me that their afforded wages do not give them enough income to go to the hospital to tend to even a leech bite or simple stomach ache. And if they do go to the hospital closest to their homes on the estates, the government hospital does not have any medicines, and they are directed to private channeling centers to purchase their medication on the private market. And essential medicines such as those for gastritis or blood pressure that would cost 700 rupees a month now cost over 5,000 rupees a month. So many are simply not taking medicine, or they're pacing out their medicines for illnesses or medical conditions that they have. Essential items such as flour, rice, milk powder, and eggs have more than tripled in price. And the private bus fare to and from one estate that I visited that was once 25 rupees in 2019 is now 84 rupees one way. And on that route, there are no government buses, which speaks to this Pradesh Sabha Act, and there's no government buses running. So estate residents are kind of forced to rely on these privately run buses or use three wheels, which also must hike up their prices due to the fuel costs and QR codes. So these price hikes are not uniformly experienced in the plantation areas, but also in the villages in Northern Province, where the populations are majority Malayaha Tamil. And I don't have time to speak to the kind of histories of settlement that Thiruni alluded to, but also in Northern Province, given the resettlement schemes after the war that Malayaha Tamils really were excluded from. Just to give context, even smaller roadside shops that are close to villages are hiking up their prices because in town they'll be cheaper, and so you can't get to those places, and you must purchase the higher priced goods. So with wages not enough, families are taking out private loans at high interest rates that are unregulated, and if taken with informal money lenders, up to more than 30%, and with finance companies that are lining the streets of towns in Northern Province, really at 28 or 30%, and they're not able to pay back these loans. So to conclude, I think there needs to be a public conversation about what the plantations mean, both historically and economically, to this current government and the governments before it. And in this crisis, what their stakes are in maintaining those labor hierarchies and forms of subtle and often unnamed forms of gender and caste discrimination. And to really ask the unions that are also political representatives as well, how to build forms of collective labor organizing that are untethered from this politics of patronage to the current government. The tea for oil barter arrangement that I described, and also the Planters Association predictable disapproval, presents this moment that I think we can pause on to more broadly investigate the historical conditions of how the quote-unquote freedoms of the plantation market are operating in Sri Lanka. As Rajan Hool and also Kiripimalla Hool demonstrate in their important book, Democracy Stillborn, the crux of the political resolution in Sri Lanka and ethno-nationalism lies at the country's founding of its democracy on fundamental rejections of Malayaha Tamils' equal rights and recognition as equal citizens. And then subsequently, as Professor Uyangoda and also Professor Kelegama have demonstrated, the state's subsequent upholding of the industries and other industrial investments in development, but also those profit margins at the expense of justifying low wages. So for Malayaha Tamils working and living beyond the plantations, that project of ethno-nationalism is doubly felt, not only because of the Civil War, but also because of the state's upholding of the industry and those profit margins. And whether it's real or speculative value that's tied to those commitments, it really maintains that socioeconomic marginalization through the law, but also through the lack of distributive forms of justice, such as a living wage, land and housing rights, educational affirmative action or opportunities, employment mobility, and equal access to local and national forms of governance. This was all done at the expense of protecting the industry's wealth, which now we know is being used to pay back the state's debts. So to conclude, as we, this is the year of the 200-year marking of plantation labor in Sri Lanka. And I think that demanding this kind of justice is not only, important, but serves as a really time where we can pause on it. And as one person told me that is Malaya Tamil in Northern Province, they questioned this remembering last month in our conversation. And he said, what exactly do we want to remember from this plantation history and why? And what will our remembering of this history mean for pushing for more forms of social transformation and alternatives for economic justice for the community moving forward? So I'll end here, but I appreciate the earlier comments and I'm looking forward to the comments of the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Mythri, for those very thought-provoking comments and for us to think how to move forward. And I realize 10-15 minutes is just not enough, but thank you very much. And the conversation, which seems to be sort of coming together. But now we have two more speakers. We have Professor Mahendran Thiruvarangan, who is a senior lecturer in English Literature, Department of Linguistics and English in University of Jaffna. He received his PhD in English from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and his work lies at the intersection of post-colonialism, decolonization, literature, land, and radical democracy. In 2019, he served on a land commission set up by the People's Alliance for Right to Land. Professor Thiruvarangan, thank you so much. The question we have for you is, could you please tell us how Tamils and Muslims in Northern Sri Lanka have participated in the protests and how the state has responded to their participation? So thank you once again, and over to you.
Thank you, Shubhra, and all the organizers for holding this event and inviting me to share my reflections. I would like to begin by giving an overview of the protest landscape of the North when the economic crisis began. So in 2009, the war came to an end, but there were people's mobilizations demanding justice for various forms of injustice that people suffered during the war and before the war and after the war. So there were some key protests like, the mothers of the disappeared who were fighting for where they were trying to find out where their children are. And then there were land grabs that were happening. The military was involved in land grab, the archaeology department, the forest department. So they were all involved in land grab, and communities were trying to reclaim the land that they lost to these processes. And then we also had protests demanding the release of political prisoners, and people were also demanding accountability for war crimes. And then there were also protests that were not really related to the war and the ethnic question. Women were protesting against predatory microfinance companies in the North, and there were oppressed caste communities or Panchamar communities who were protesting when some cremation grounds were started to refunction, and these cremation grounds were located near their houses, and people didn't want those cremation grounds to function. So there were protests around those issues. And then the fishermen were protesting against poaching by Indian trawlers. So these were some of the key protests that were happening in the North even before the economic crisis set in. So when the economic crisis set in, it created a conversation whether the Tamils in the North should protest or not. There were different positions. Some groups said, we will not protest because the nationalist groups were particularly interested in maintaining this narrative that, in the North or among Northern Tamils, it's the political issues that matter a lot. And like, if we give importance to economic issues and the economic struggle that is going on, then, like, the international community wouldn't take notice of the political struggle and the demands that were associated with the political struggle. So there was a group that was actively even discouraging protests. So, even within our University Teachers Association, when we had this conversation, some people really wanted us to remain silent because this silence is going to be helpful to the Tamils and the international community was going to do something. But there were other groups which wanted to have these protests, or at least they wanted a conversation about, the economic crisis and how this economic crisis was linked to the war and the ethnic question, and how, as Thiruni mentioned, like, how development and ethnicity were so strongly related. And so that was another group that thought, like, this conversation was necessary. So there were groups that protested too, right? There was the University Teachers Association, the Fisheries Associations in Jaffna, and then the new Democratic Marxist-Leninist Party, and then there was also a TNA-led group. They all protested. These were very small-scale protests. But what was interesting was that these protests, in a way, combined some of the long-standing demands of the Tamils with these new demands related to the economic crisis. So people came up with demands like, abolishing executive presidency, wealth tax, then a redistributive economy, redistribution of land. So these were some of the key demands. But at the same time, people also called for a federal solution, justice for the disappeared, justice for war crimes. So these demands were different, I think, in the North. But there were others who remained, who didn't want to protest, but they were also asking important questions. And these questions were directed not just to the state, but also the protesters in the South. So, like, there was an economic crisis in the North during the war. There was an economic embargo. There was no gas, no electricity for a long period of time. So people went through this situation in the North earlier, but somehow trade unions and other activists and student groups, they didn't raise these issues, right? They didn't see these issues as their problems, or they didn't want to extend solidarity to the Tamils who were suffering because of the economic embargo. And people also asked questions related to how, like, the Malayaha Tamil community was treated badly ever since independence and how they were exploited economically. People also spoke about how, in conflict-affected regions like Nayaru, I think, which is very close to Velioya in the Mullaitivu district, where there is a conflict between local fishermen who are predominantly Tamil and then Sinhalese fishermen who would come as migrant fishermen, and then they were backed by the state. And so the state was in a way like denying the rights of the local fishermen. So there was an economic problem, but then that also had an ethnic dimension. So, like, did the Southern protesters really raise these issues? Did they really talk about how ethnicity and development and economy were intertwined, right? So these questions were raised in a productive manner, I thought, even by those who didn't really participate in the struggle. So in some of the protests, the Muslim community in the North also joined. And before that, also during the COVID crisis, there was a protest in Jaffna that was mainly organized to condemn the forcible cremation of those Muslims who died of COVID-19. So there was participation by Muslims in some of the protests organized around the economic crisis later on. As far as the state's response is concerned, whenever there is a protest in Jaffna, you would see, people who are close to the military or affiliated with the military or the military intelligence wing who would come with cameras and record these protests. And this is something that we would see often when we have protests at the university. So when Tamil students commemorate the LTTE cadres, or when they commemorate those who died during the war. So this surveillance was there. So when we had protests outside the university during the economic crisis, again, the same people came with their cameras. But I think, this was a countrywide protest. So So they didn't they were not really worried that Northerners are also protesting, because I think at the time everybody's attention was on the South, because, in terms of number, the Southern protest or the protest at Galle was very huge compared to the protest that we had in the North. And there were also differences in the way people in the North protested. For instance, when we organized our protest, we didn't carry the national flag, or people didn't sing the national anthem. So people didn't talk about a common Sri Lankan identity as such. But, on the whole, what I would say is that this was a productive moment in many ways, because this allowed Northern Tamils and Northern Muslims to bring to the fore certain questions that have been ignored in the Southern protest movement. So, and then later on, if you see, some of the conversations are still continuing. For instance, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, there is a campaign in the South against this act. And Northern Tamil politicians have also taken a lead role in this campaign. And then there are students from the South who are now coming to Jaffna and talking to activists and student groups in the North about the PTA. And these conversations are sometimes, they have been difficult. Sometimes, people get angry, people question the student leaders from the South, what did you do when students in the North were arrested and detained under Prevention of Terrorism Act, and when people went through immense suffering during the war. So I think when these questions are raised, when the Southern activists and leaders are questioned, I think they also now seem to understand that there are certain things that they have to do to, start a conversation with those who suffered during the war in the North. And there is that opening that is happening. But I think more work has to be done, and there should be more conversations about these issues. But the last point that I would like to make is, the North is also not homogeneous. It's not just Tamil, because the Muslims who were evicted by the LTT in 1990 are returning to the North, or have returned. Many of them have returned. Some others are still returning, and they face landlessness. They face livelihood issues. And as Mythri said, we also have a Malayaha Tamil population in certain parts of the North, and they have land and livelihood issues. And then the Panjamar communities, or the oppressed caste communities, who have been landless for centuries. And this economic crisis has, hit these communities really adversely. So when we talk about, the economic crisis and how it has animated the North, yes, there is always, a very dominant ethnic character to everything that happens in the North, and it is always understood through an ethnic lens. But I think there are also other lenses through which we have to understand it, through caste and class and the experiences of the Malayaha Tamil communities and the returning Muslims. So I think conversations have to happen in those directions to understand how the crisis has affected, and how community and the need for the communities to come together and build alliances towards, broadening the question of justice, right? It's not just justice for the war crimes, but also economic justice that is needed in the North too, right? So on that note, I would like to end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahendran, for your comments. Thought-provoking and something for us to mobilize around. Our last speaker in the panel is Swasthika Arulingam. I have a very brief bio for her, and perhaps you may want to add. She's attorney at law and is the president of the Commercial and Industrial Workers Union in Sri Lanka. Swasthika, we have a couple of questions for you, and you may choose to answer whichever way you want. So some of the issues have been addressed a bit, but if you could elaborate on how the protests were different from other protests that have happened in the past, and something to which Mahendran was referring to, what are the role of community organizations in bringing people together in this moment of crisis. So to you.
Thank you, Shubhra, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I also want to, it was quite heartening to hear Thiru Mahendran, who lives in the North, who lives in Jaffna, and for him to say that there are many positive things which came out of this protest, which happened last year And the culmination of that was July 9th, which has never seen before in the history of Sri Lanka. And it's important to hear that because since the end of the protest, because it was crushed with the military presence on the ground, several criticisms have come up on the way the protest was done, who was behind the protest, was there international actors backing it, and so many criticisms which were coming our way. So maybe what I will do is I will just give you a sense of what was happening last year on the ground, because I was there. And then also speak a little bit about the aftermath of the protest and what we felt, which were some of the achievements and some of the criticisms of the protest. So I think to put it very simply, there was a lot of resentment which was growing because of the economic policies. It was a long time coming, but at least in the capital city, Colombo, there was a lot of resentment because life as we know it had come to a standstill. There were fuel queues, there was gas distribution has stopped. So there was a lot of resentment. There were electricity, there were power cuts, long power cuts. And I think this resentment kind of slowly started trickling onto the streets, where you found urban middle class families coming onto the streets and having these roadside protests. And people like me, for instance, we were quite skeptical about these roadside protests because we have seen this happening in the past, and it never takes off anyway. It stops 1 or 2 days after it stops. But I think because the crisis was so deep and so strong and so prevalent, these roadside protests continued. And I think at some point, people started converging. Different cities started converging, even different locations started converging. And there was a moment in March, towards the end of March 2022, where a group of protesters were protesting in front of the president's residence, were attacked by the special task force of the police. And that became a violent rupture in the whole scene of neighborhood protests and these peaceful protests which were going on until that point. And lawyers started getting involved in the protest movement, and unprecedentedly 400 lawyers appeared for pro bono appeared for these protesters, showing their sign of solidarity also towards this protest movement. So that moment where the peaceful protest kind of erupted into violence due to the intervention of the state law enforcement authority kind of spilled over into a location called the Golface, which I would argue is one of the most prime properties in the city of Colombo. And these very ordinary people without political or without economic power simply went into this Golface stretch and occupied this place quite successfully for 3-4 months. And that is the start of this protest movement. And of course, once this group of middle class people started occupying this Golface movement, I think the establishment at that time also underestimated what this protest movement can do in terms of resistance. But once traditional groups such as student groups, trade unions, left political parties who are more known to come out to the streets in protest, when they saw this, they also got on board and started supporting this protest movement. And I think that is how it kind of obtained mass support, and the numbers came in through the support of these traditional groups which have been engaged or used to be engaged in street resistance. So few reflections on this Golface occupation is that one of the most telling things for me is the fact that the Rajapaksas, over a period of 10 years, one of their prime projects was to urbanize or to build the city and push the urban poor out of the city or into the margins of the city. So their entire thing was about beautifying the cities, Colombo city, and so on. So it is on that kind of political terrain that this ordinary group of people came and occupied one of the most prime properties in Colombo. And that was a moment of class, almost like a class victory, even though it lasted only for a few months. And the other thing, of course, is the establishment. The Rajapaksas completely underestimated the anger, the simmering tensions within the entire within different sections of populations in Sri Lanka because of the economic crisis. And the fact that this Golface protest, also known as the Aragalia, managed to contain this anger in a peaceful sense of resistance or a peaceful protest. So they would say this is a peaceful Aragalia. The people prided in calling it a peaceful struggle. So I think the Rajapaksas completely underestimated how this protest contained the anger which existed in the larger society. So when the prime minister at that time in 2022, Mahendra Rajapaksa, was forced to resign, he decided to unleash violence on the Gulf-based protesters. And the moment he brought in a group of armed men and started attacking these peaceful protests, almost all the suburbs and the neighboring cities of Colombo burst out into violence, and there were violent attacks on parliamentarian houses. There was a lot of violence, and politicians were under attack. So I think the establishment also underestimated how much of the anger this call-face space also contained in terms of, yes, we want a regime change, but we want it done peacefully. And of course, the July 9th movement, anyone who was on the ground, it was just unimaginable. It was a pure moment where people came together from all classes and said, we want this president to go home. Of course, we were not expecting another person who has been in politics for 46 years to come in his place, but that is what people wanted. And I think in a sense that goal was achieved through the people's movement. But because it was such an unbelievable moment, even people inside Sri Lanka would raise questions and doubts as to the motives of the protesters, whether we were funded by international actors or whether some state was behind this and so on. How I would see it is that the protest itself was not, it was a pure moment where people came together because the crisis was so deep. So there's nothing preventing, people had nothing to lose other than to come and fight. But the suppression which happened afterwards, the coming into power of Ranil Wickremesinghe, and the fact that he had successfully stayed on in power despite the continuing crisis, and the fact that he has managed to create this sense of normalcy, at least within certain sections of the middle class population, that I would say has been backed by different states who have a particular interest in keeping Ranil Wickremesinghe in power, particularly when this IMF deal is coming on. So I would say the fall of the Aragalaya was definitely backed up by different states coming and backing up and saying, no, now enough of your protests. We want a peaceful Sri Lanka so that we can drive through our development agenda, or what we think should be development inside Sri Lanka. And the previous speakers also spoke about race relations, and they also spoke about, I think Thiruni spoke about the concept of development in Sri Lanka. And what we are seeing right now is a president who is who does not have the popular mandate of the people, who came into being the president because of a parliamentary vote. And his only support base, I would say, is the party, the Rajapaksa's party, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. And he has surrounded himself with the military. So he is crushing any kind of dissent which is rising on the ground. Yesterday there was a protest by the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation workers, and the leaders who was organizing this protest was interdicted or was sent home. So he is showing absolutely no restraint on crushing protesters on the ground. Since the end of the Aragalaya, there has been 2 people who have died due to tear gassing by the state. As someone mentioned, the government is passing something called the Anti-Terror Act right now, which is like the new face of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which makes even a simple protest or simply holding a board against the government an act of terrorism. So we are watching these things. And of course, since Ranil Wickremesinghe has come to power, what we have seen is a no tolerance policy towards any kind of resistance which is coming on the ground. But what is interesting also is that people are not just sitting and waiting, because the crisis is very deep. And how I would describe it if you go to the, let's say if you go to the plantation, or if you go to the free trade zones, where the export industry, where the export sector industry is based, wages have stagnated there. People are paid around 30,000 rupees per month. The cost of living has gone up, so people are no longer eating. So there's a lot of resentment growing on the ground. And what is concerning for many of us who are watching this process, who are also part of trade unions and so on, is that last year the protest movement was peaceful. So it managed to contain the anger and the discontent through this peaceful resistance. But since this peaceful resistance has been broken, now we fear, particularly people in Colombo, we fear that the next resistance which is going to come might not be peaceful, particularly because the government is using the armed forces without any restraint. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swastika, for those comments and some real reasons to worry about the way things are going on and how dissent is being criminalized and how these acts of terrorism are being passed and what is to come is actually more worrisome. If not, then perhaps we can open the floor and ask any of the from the audience. We can take a few questions. Given the constraint of time, please, I will request you to keep your comments very, very brief. And if it's targeted, if it's presented to the panel, please mention that, or if it's to one of the speakers, please do mention. Could you please raise your hands and or using the reaction box at the bottom? That'll be greatly appreciated. Any questions? Yes, John Rogers, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm John Rogers from the American Institute for Sri Lankan Studies. One thing that was striking about the series of very stimulating comments is that nobody mentioned the formal opposition, the primary opposition, the NPP or the SJB. So I wonder if one or more of the panelists might want to comment briefly on that. That might show perhaps a deeper malaise in the political class that nobody thought of even mentioning them.
Well, if I may briefly comment on John's comment, the NPP, the JVP, and even the Frontline Socialist Party have been trying to establish links with the Tamil, people, working people, and progressive political groups in the plantation areas as well as in the north. But there's a problem as far as both Frontline Socialist Party and the JVP. Actually, Frontline Socialist Party is a more radical breakaway group from the JVP. They are very, ambiguous about the political rights of the Tamil people and Muslim people. They don't want to support even the 13th Amendment openly. You see, they would say that when they come into power, the problems of the Tamil people would be solved by them. They don't go beyond that. So that's I think the challenge that even student leaders who have been visiting Jaffna to meet people in Jaffna, as Thiru said, they will have to confront that problem. And I hope that conversation that they have started with student activists in Jaffna would compel them to rethink their silence on the ethnic question and minority rights. And SJB, there's Samagi Jana Balavegi, I think John asked about SJB as well. They're the other leading political opposition party. I think they have links with the plantation Tamil people, but they're very formal political party, election alliances based links, not organic political links with the plantation, people, Malayaga Tamil people. I'm sorry, I'm using this old word. Plantation is not, the politically correct term, Malayaga Tamil people. And SJB doesn't have those organic links. I don't think the JVP or the FSP have organic links with the Malayaga Tamil people either. So that's my response to your comment, John.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, I would invite Ranjit K. first to introduce yourself and let us know if the questions for the panel or some. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm Ranjit. I'm joining from Toronto, student at York University. My question is, what has it, if at all, the Sinhalese Buddhist consciousness changed during this Aragalaya and within this period of 1 year? Because it's the same Sinhalese Buddhist community who overwhelmingly put the Rajapaksa regime to power, to the extent that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was portrayed as one of those mythical king coming to save the paradise on earth. Now, that was the level of Sinhalese Buddhist vicious nationalism existed in or exists in Canada, in Sri Lanka. And has Aragalaya changed that public consciousness, or has it, through the Aragalaya, has it become more insidious and subtle?
I don't think it has, Aragalaya has really challenged the Sinhala Buddhist conscience as you framed it, because this Aragalaya was very limited to the economic crisis and almost a spontaneous uprising or dealing with the tensions which existed at the time, continues to exist in society also. So very recently, when I was having a conversation with a group of Sinhalese who engaged very actively in the Aragalaya, they said, we don't understand why the northern people are not joining us. We even visited Jaffna and we were speaking to them, but they're very, very reluctant to engage with us. And the response to that, which was given by a group of people from Jaffna, is that they said, we would also like to join the Aragalaya, but when we do join, the government will put us under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And when they put us under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, would you come and support us and tell the government not to do this? So he very simply put it, and he said, we have walked over dead bodies, we have faced the war, so many people have died, and none of you spoke about it at that time. So are you ready to have these conversations now? So I don't think it has altered the Sinhala Buddhist consciousness, or this idea of that they have actually consciously, or the Sinhalese population as a whole, through an inherent sense of race superiority, has done something wrong to the Tamil people, because I don't think there was space enough to have that conversation. But I think because of these questions which are rising, why aren't the northern people or the eastern people and the Malaya people, why aren't they joining our struggle? Because of the questions they're asking, they're also able to hear the answers which are coming from the minorities. I also want to maybe add a little bit more to what Professor Uyangoda said about the NPP and the SJB. Apart from their issues, or the fact that they are unable to confront the whole ethnic question or the national question, we also don't have an opposition in the country. Now, for instance, the NPP has the basis of the NPP is a party called the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, which is a left party in Sri Lanka. But it has almost morphed into something called the NPP. And if you look at the policies and principles of the NPP, it is no longer left. I mean, they would support the IMF, they would support privatization, they are silent when unions are crushed. So NPP is no longer, I would not consider NPP to be any more a left party, or a party with a left kind of ideology or sense. And the SJB is a breakaway faction from a traditional political party, the United National Party, from which Ranil Wickremesinghe comes from. The SJB, to me at least, it sounds like a group of people strung together. There is no leadership as such. Everyone comes and tells their opinion on a matter. So you can't hold the party to one opinion. So some have a bit towards a socialist idea or social democratic idea. Some people have extreme capitalist ideas. Some are racist. Some are, we need to build bridges between the minorities. So there is no sense of opposition inside the parliament. And that is one of the reasons why, particularly because Ranil Wickremesinghe has been able to successfully push through very repressive legislation, including legislation like the Bureau of Rehabilitation, which is essentially the creation of camps under the guise of rehabilitation, where anyone who dissenting against the government will now be able to, the government will be able to herd them into places called rehabilitation centers and essentially extract forced labor, torture, and so on and so forth. And now that is legal now. So one of the reasons why the parliament or Ranil Wickremesinghe has been able to push through all of his repressive policies is because we don't have an opposition in parliament. And even if they don't have the numbers in parliament, at least they're not building opposition on the ground. So that is the sad reality in Sri Lanka in terms of the political terrain. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Cool.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ratnajeevan Hool, calling from Trincomalee in the northeast of Sri Lanka. I live in Jaffna, but I am now speaking from Trincomalee.
We are not able to hear you clearly.
I'm sorry, maybe my internet is poor. I'm using a hotspot.
I think so.
Yeah.
Is it possible for you to type the question for us on the chat box?
That's my comment. So I don't know, maybe I mean, Professor Uyangoda is one of the more liberal Sinhalese. He may support both, but the vast majority do not support either end. So making common cause is a very tough proposition for us. Normally, I would have joined the Aragalaya, but these have prevented me from doing that.
So you call me a liberal Sinhalese. I don't. I hope it's not a backhanded compliment.
No, I meant it as a compliment, full compliment.
Well, you see, I can link my response to the question asked by Ranjit as well. You know, I don't think Aragalaya changed the Sinhala Buddhist nationalist ideology as such. But it's very important for us not to ignore the fact that Aragalaya marked ideological crisis of the Rajapaksa project, right? That is very important. You know, the Rajapaksa's ideological hegemony has been in crisis, and the Aragalaya represented that crisis. That is why, you know, there were no Sinhala nationalist slogans emerging from within Aragalaya, right? But even, you know, I have been there. I think Swasthika can tell us, she was there more than I did in terms of time spending there. But no single slogan of Sinhala nationalism there raised by any group that can be described as a, as subscribing to the Rajapaksa project. You see, Rajapaksa project in politically and ideologically has been in deep crisis. And Aragalaya was the moment of, that crisis being expressed by the people. So I think we have to make a subtle distinction between what Aragalaya has done and what Aragalaya actually marked and represented politically. So that's my response to, Dr. Jeevanpol's comment as well. Because Sinhala nationalism's Rajapaksa version is no longer politically significant in Sri Lanka. And I think Ranil Wickremesinghe was also trying to, make use of that break for his political advantage at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really thought-provoking and engaging comments. There are a few and quite a few on the chat box as well. I think if there is no further pressing conversations, and I completely agree, this was given the complexity of the crisis and the situation and what it means for just not for Sri Lanka, for those of us who are observing it from outside, this is just not enough time. This is just the beginning of the conversation. I hope we can continue the conversation. I'm truly grateful for your time, for your engagement, for your comments, and for those who are presenting, of course, and for those of you who are participating in discussion as well. So thank you very much, and thank you, and look forward to a future conversation another time. Thank you.